I want to talk about one variable among the many of decenteredness and dislocation with us as a race, and that is Black African people. And I want to make reference to this as a global phenomenon, the global African Black problem, of decenteredness and dislocation, problem of diversion from the core issue. And that is politics of protestation. Politics of protestation. We have been reduced to playing marbles of politics of protestation, temper tantrums, crybaby temper tantrums for crumbs under our enslavers, our oppressors, our degraders, our exploiters, tables, instead of building our own and dressing it in our own terms and reclining to dine on it as an independent and sovereign people. So this game of marbles, of politics of protestation, is only a reaffirmation of our subservience and of the white terror and deceit domination as the bearer of solutions for us, as twisted as this might sound. But this is the paradox that I want to use to try drive the point home. It is over the same crumbs falling from our invaders, our exploiters, our oppressors, our degraders, tables. We would even go as far as unaliving one another in spite of the bemoanable state of disaggregation and dehumanization we are in as Black people. So I submit that it is only upon realizing this one thing as a race, upon realizing that our problems with the hegemony of this white terror domination and deceit dynamic are at their root problems of sheer powerlessness. So as African people, we are not only oppressed, degraded, discriminated against in the area of politics and economics. It is my submission that we do not need political parties as vehicles for our liberation. We don't. And further submit that what we need is what I call a an African-centered revolutionary vanguard movement. That's all we need as Black African people, and which will launch a global response to the white terror, domination, and deceit global dynamic, with all Black African people wherever they may be found on the globe. So I will list a number of things that I view our problem as fundamentally characterized with. Now, at the root of powerlessness, then this is what we need to emerge with as our reascension back to our position of power and sovereignty as the Black race. So we need number one, we would need a spiritual-cultural dimension to power as we reascend back to it. What do I mean by that? Knowing ourselves and developing a worldview that would encapsulate our essence as a people, to ensuring the emergence of authentic African-centered people to existence, and which would give our consciousness a directional aspect. I'm referring to the center that we need to realign with, the center we have been dislocated from, the center we have, and the center that I'm referring to is your spiritual cultural center, which is a worldview coupled with how we have and have been and should be negotiating our existence with our environment on how to cultivate a way of life. This is what I mean by spiritual cultural. It is that type of grounding. And coupled with that is secondly the educational dimension of power. So one of the mentals that we need to seize, back to our control, back, to power, we would have, ascended back to by realigning with our center, is the power to define. And this would entail producing knowledge, creating and producing knowledge that would respond to and serve values that capture our true essence as Black African people, and our needs as defined in terms of such values, and establishing a systematic and institutional framework through which such knowledge could be preserved and disseminated. Here, I'm not talking about simply engaging in the futility of attempting to do the logically impossible, and that is seeking to decolonize what was never colonized, in the first place, seeking to decolonize the very instruments, and institutional frameworks, of colonization, which have to simply be discarded, which have to simply be, obliterated. And having seized the power to define, we, in expressing and manifesting the African autonomous thought, and having obliterated all that threatens our quest to realizing the reestablishment of sovereignty, obliterated and completely destroyed. So I'm not talking about taking charge nominally, of some colonial institutions, and operating and functioning within administrative colonial parameters, wherein you are simply allowed, or you are simply given the latitude to sprinkle some impressive African-centered topics in the largely Europe-centered body of knowledge, and you call that, decoloniality. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about taking charge as tokens of the menticide camps our invaders imposed on us as universities and colleges and other schools, and only settle for Bantustanization of African-centered bodies of knowledge in a form of Department of Indigenous Knowledge Systems, Department of African Studies, when the rest of the body of knowledge in the curriculum is European proper. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about true independence and sovereignty when it comes to knowledge creation and production, and ultimately dissemination. Knowledge that would have been purposed to respond to particular real needs of African people, promptings and yearnings of African people based on their true aspirations and not falsified ones at that. That's the knowledge I'm talking about, which is a separate epistemological stream that would require a separate, independent, and sovereign institutional framework to be, conveyed in. So, thirdly, ironically, then the political dimension of power becomes the third. But as I mentioned earlier, that the a priori reduction of our problem to politics and economics is responsible for the mostly prevalent dislocated and decentered view that Black African people have to their own reality, which plagues, the observation, the analysis, and conclusions with, so much misdiagnosis, which, precipitates, which misdiagnosis, precipitates for prescription of false remedies. That is why we are where we are to this day. And then speaking to the third aspect, that emerging from powerlessness to reascend back to power we need to deal with, is to have the mantle of, political power restored back to us. Now, issues of governance here would simply refer to maintenance of a properly organized and ran society, This is, by the way, the administrative and coordinative aspect of power relations. And politics is simply that, how power relations are coordinated, administratively. Politics is simply that. And this is the political dimension of power that I'm referring to. And then fourthly, you have the legal dimension of power, whose mantle, must also, be restored on this quest to reascend back to power as Black African people. And this would mean making laws that are reflective of the agreed values of the people, to whom these laws, are intended to apply, lest, the system itself would get, compromised with legitimacy crisis, meaning you'd have a legal system that is not, reflective of African-centered, paradigms, African-centered conceptology, African-centered philosophies, and then you apply these laws to people who do not have spiritual-cultural synergy with, and then you'd have legitimacy crisis with your legal system, as we currently have. So we have to develop a legal philosophy that foregrounds African-centered worldviews. That's what we would need to develop. And fifthly, we will have to deal with the economic dimension of power. Here, what would be entailed is establishing an economic system that ensures people do not have a schizophrenic relationship with themselves, a system that does not place people in conflict with their life-defining mores, cultures, and cosmologies. So property from this paradigm should only mean having our resources as enablers for us to fulfill and reach our existential fullness in alignment with our essential nature as culturally and cosmologically mapped out. So you have success defined in terms of a collective achievement that is based on cooperation and not a drive that is geared by competition, evoking individualistic, ambitions among people. You are not talking about that, but you talk about African-centered cooperative, economics. That's what you're talking about. So you don't need to embrace any leftist, Marxist, whether orthodox or neo, or hybridized, in hyphenated forms. You don't need that. Our struggle is not worker struggle. Our struggle is a struggle of a people who have fundamentally been alienated from their being, from their humanity, who fundamentally strive in their struggles to have their humanity restored back to them before all else. It's not, as in Marxist terms, a simple, matter of being alienated from labor as a worker. No, we first and foremost, as a fundamental, engage in a rehumanization project, of Black African people before we deal with, how we relate to resources. The very beingness of being Black, of being African, is what we are fundamentally alienated from, with which, the class, theories, from the leftist, ideological cartography, has nothing to offer, when it comes to addressing. So the last but not the least, is the military aspect of power. So having re-established all of those, we would need a perpetual defense of our of our established, authentic, sane, functional, fruitful, harmonious, self-defined, self-determined, independent, and sovereign existence as African people, which would foreground, all of the above mentioned. So this is power holistically, and then we have been made to play these marbles of white politics that have made us temper tantrums, throwing crybabies at, our abusers, our enslavers, our exploiters, our invaders, our dehumanizers. Then that has to stop. Then which would obviously, if it has to stop, prompt for segmentation, where we have to separate ourselves, where we have to disengage, where we have to remobilize, all our strengths, all our energies, our power, to be restored with, all the remobilization that we would have, engaged in, to be in a position to affront, confront, expose, and destroy the fundamental lies of the anti-Black world we have been made pawns in. Yeah, that's all I needed to share with you, family, and peace and love to you. In the name of African-centered sovereignty, I greet you. Peace.